One of the best parts of homeschooling for me is that I get to teach other people's children too. I have an only child, well, one who's grown in gall, so I have essentially an only child, and he needs more social time. So every year I would plan out what I want him to know, and then structure it into a class and invite his friends in. So, without a doubt, one of my favorite classes was when I taught Saving Leonardo in manuscript form. This book has been through the mind of teenagers. They are the best editors I've ever had. Whatever they didn't understand, I went home and rewrote. It had 2 different classes on it, so it's been through the minds of several teenagers. It was great. And the book also addresses some of the main reasons that Christians homeschool in the first place. Number 1, to teach every subject area from a Christian perspective, and to train our children to recognize and critique non-Christian worldviews as well. We want them to have that critical grid in place so that they are not going to absorb non-Christian ideas without even knowing it. One reason it's been difficult for Christians to think in terms of worldview is that the modern education is so fragmented. Each subject is set off from the others. So in Saving Leonardo, what I do is I show the connecting links. In modern society, certainly since the scientific revolution, new ideas tend to come out of science. The rest of the culture has to respond to whatever science says. That's why it's crucial to know your science history. Where's Lee? Are you hearing me? That's why it's crucial to know your science. Because new ideas, the leading ideas have come out of science. Then the philosophers come along and try to interpret the scientific findings. And then finally the artists and writers come, and filmmakers, and picture what these ideas mean for the general public. And that's when it filters down to the general public. And it's that last stage, how it permeates the rest of society, is where I think is the most important in terms of understanding our culture, sort of getting the tools to understand the people you actually interact with day by day. This is where most people pick up their ideas about life, right? They're not signing up for philosophy classes at the local university. They're picking up their ideas from the books they read and the movies they watch, music they listen to. The arts have the power to channel ideas deeply into our minds and emotions. They can bypass our critical grid, override our logic, and hook us emotionally. So my goal here, and in Saving Leonardo, is to equip you to recognize ideas when they're communicated not in words, where they're easier to pick up, but in image and story and plotline and characterization. The arts are a language which we need to teach our children how to interpret so that they will be equipped to stand against dangerous and destructive secular worldviews. So let's look at some of the ideas that have permeated society through art and literature. Many scientifically educated people today believe that the only form of knowledge consists of empirical, scientifically verified facts. So let's start with empiricism. The idea that the only things that are really true are what you can see, hear, weigh, and measure. Now, you may not run into people who will tell you, I've converted to empiricism. It's not one of those things people consciously pick up. But if you have gone through the public education system, most people today hold it as an unexamined background belief that what you can really rely on is empirical facts. Everything else is merely opinion or preference. In fact, I talked to somebody just 2 days ago who told me he was a lawyer. A lawyer was talking to him and said, I don't believe in Christianity because you can't prove that there's a soul by scientific methods. So I don't have to pay any attention to Christianity because I know science can't prove the soul. That settled it for him. Okay, so people like that have if you want a label for that, they're empiricists. They have accepted the idea that science is the ultimate truth. And like this lawyer, if you are an empiricist, obviously you are going to question or reject core concepts in Christianity, like the resurrection of Christ or any of the other miracles recorded in Scripture, or even the existence of the supernatural itself. Let me give you a handy example. Of the new atheist. Here's Sam Harris. He says, every religion preaches the truth of propositions for which it has no evidence. for which no evidence is even conceivable. Well, of course, that begs the question, what qualifies as evidence? What would he accept as valid evidence? Well, throughout the book, it's pretty clear that for him, the final court of appeal is science. Just like the lawyer, if it can't be proved by science, it isn't true. So how has the philosophy of empiricism filtered down to ordinary people through art and literature? Well, up until the modern age, artists felt perfectly comfortable giving visible form to invisible realities. So they might use personifications to represent abstract ideals like love or justice. They might depict spiritual realities like God, angels. A strict empiricism, though, says it's not possible for humans to know anything beyond the sensory world. So painters began to say, we can only paint visual sensations, only what the eye sees. This is what Goya meant when he said, there's no reason why my brush should see anything more than I do. He meant I can only paint what I see. So he portrays a terrible massacre of the French soldiers, of the Spanish peasants, but he refuses to give it any spiritual meaning. In fact, he was deliberately subverting a long tradition of martyrdom paintings, like the one on the left, which historians think was the inspiration for Goya's painting. In traditional paintings, the martyr looks up to heaven, confident that God will ultimately bring justice. But Goya's victim appeals hopelessly to his murderers. The martyr painting shows the heavens opening and angels preparing the martyr's crown. But in Goya, the heavens are closed. If you can see, there's a church steeple, too, that remains silent in the dark background, which means Christianity has no answers. One art historian concludes, no other painter has seen the world more naked of saving grace. Now, Goya was an early representative of realism, which is typically defined as a movement that aims at an objective, factual, value-free depiction of events. But is this really value-free? Compare it to a later one by Monet that's obviously modeled on it. What differences do you see? Well, first of all, there's no sense of the tragic outrage that you saw in Goya, right? Goya highlights the faces of his victims to emphasize the injustice being done to them. In Monet, you can hardly even make out their faces. Goya's soldiers are stiff, stylized, as though to represent almost like a machine, right? Mechanized cruelty. But Monet's soldiers are just doing their job, especially the soldier on the right who's preparing his rifle for the coup de grace. And I don't know if you can see, but there's onlookers peering over the wall. Do they look horrified? No, they're just curious. So Goya, although he was an empiricist, he had not really broken yet from the long-standing view that art should convey a theme, a perspective, a statement of what the events mean. What would you think his theme was? The horror of injustice, the inhumanity of man to man, something like that. But Monet shows us only the surface of things. He's much more consistent in giving us just a visual report. Now, the term realism was actually coined to describe the work of Gustave Courbet. He stated the empiricist program in these words: the art of painting should consist only in the representation of objects which the artist can see and touch. He was once preparing a painting for a church, and he was asked to include some angels. And he famously responded, I've never seen angels. Show me an angel, I'll paint one. If I can't see it, I can't paint it. This painting of a funeral sparked enormous controversy, precisely because people expected a work dealing with a subject as serious as death to convey some sense of its significance, like this earlier painting of the death of Socrates. But Courbet was saying there is no deeper significance, and he does it by the haphazard composition, the bleak sky, the barren cliffs, the grave that's nothing but a hole in the dirt. All was seemed to imply that this is an event without any higher meaning. There's only the empirical, physical dimension, what the eye sees. Now, if artists are going to paint only what the eye sees, what does the eye see exactly? That question was taken up by the Impressionists, and they were influenced by an even more radical empiricism, sometimes called positivism, It claims we actually don't know anything about the world as it really is. All we have are observation reports. What do I mean by that? If you look at, this stand that's on the stand here that I'm on, what do you really see? Well, a black rectangle, flat, smooth, hard. But those are just sense data. How do I know what's really under the sense data? The positivists hope that by clearing away everything except direct sense data, we could gain a foolproof foundation for knowledge. Why? Well, because at this level you can't be mistaken. If you make mistakes, which we all do, that happens in the process of interpreting sense data. Maybe this isn't really a metal stand, maybe it's wood, or maybe it's plastic. But if I could suspend all my interpretation, all my inferences, and get in touch with just raw, immediate sense data, those are the things we cannot be mistaken about. Visual sensations, streaks, spots, patches of color. That's why Monet said, when you go out to paint, try to forget the objects you have in front of you, a tree, a house, a field, whatever. Merely think, here's a little square of blue. Here's an oblong of pink. Here's a streak of yellow. Monet even said he wished he'd been born blind and received his sight for the first time as an adult. What happens in that case? Do you know? People who receive sight for the first time as an adult find it very difficult. They have no depth perception. They can't pick out object from background. All they see is color patches. So Monet was really saying, I wish I was in a position not to be able to interpret what I'm seeing. I wish I had access to the raw data of a sensation, which empiricism teaches is the infallible foundation for knowledge. So clearly Monet was not just interested in painting pretty pictures. He was wrestling with the question of knowledge, epistemology. This was a radical break with all earlier conceptions of art. One historian writes, for all their differences, no earlier schools of art had doubted the assumption that we're here for a reason, that there's a harmony, a discoverable truth, a meaningful order, a universal plan. But according to empiricism, the only things humans really have access to is a random flux of sensations. And so by the time of the Impressionists, man could no longer hope to achieve the expression of an ideal universal order. We must be content with those small and commonplace fragments of an infinitely complex world. So art began to reflect that fragmentation. If the world itself has no coherent storyline, no universal plan, then artists began to feel that art should not convey a story either. No narrative that ties things together into a coherent whole. So in this painting by Degas that you see here, you see the arbitrary cropping of the image, the off-center angle of vision. Even dancers with their head cut off along the top. You see that? This is the slice of life effect, a chance moment sliced off from the random flux of sensations. For contrast, look at the painting on the left by Da Vinci. Now, he uses the traditional pyramid construction to draw the elements together into unified composition and to focus our interest on what's most important in the center. But for Degas, what's in the center? Yeah, nothing. Nothing. Everything's incidental, happening on the side, partly cut off. Even the ballet rehearsal, which is supposedly the theme of the painting, is partly obstructed by the staircase. What you get here is a chance point of view, as though someone had just happened to come in at the back of the room. One art historian calls it a slice of uninterpreted reality. So you see, when philosophers said the path to truth is to clear the mind of all interpretation, artists tried to show what an uninterpreted world looked like. Okay, let's stop here for a moment. Now that you've seen the implications of empiricism spelled out visually, how would you respond to someone who's an empiricist? Or who says to you, I can't accept Christianity because its central claims cannot be directly verified by empirical science? Well, you might respond by asking, why do you think empiricism should be the final test for truth? Does anyone really believe that the only valid knowledge is ultimately color patches? Does anyone really believe that we know nothing about the world as it is? All we have are observation reports? Do they really reject anything that's non-empirical? like love, justice, goodness. In practice, probably no one's a consistent empiricist. Even science depends on mental abstractions, such as mass, force, energy. We observe individual objects, but we never observe mass. It's an abstract concept. In fact, empiricism itself is a metaphysical concept. The central claim that everything must be empirically verified. Can that claim be empirically verified? Of course not. It's a metaphysical rule, not a finding of science. So empiricism violates its own criterion for truth. It's self-defeating. And the upshot is that probably no one's a full-blown empiricist in practice. C.S. Lewis put it very well, as he puts all things well. He says, when people claim to be skeptics, typically their skepticism is only on the surface. It's for use on other people's beliefs. They're not nearly skeptical enough about their own beliefs. So when people raise objections to Christianity based on empiricism, we should invite them to be a bit more skeptical of their skepticism. Let's consider another secular worldview. In academia today, perhaps the most widely held is philosophical naturalism or materialism, that nature or matter is all that exists. John Searle of USC, who himself is a naturalist, calls it the religion of our time, especially among professionals in the fields that study the mind, like philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science. For example, Steven Pinker is author of the best-selling book, How the Mind Works. He says there is no mind, in spite of the title. There is no mind, there's only a brain. And the brain, in turn, is nothing but a complex data processing machine, essentially a computer. Free will is an illusion. By the way, notice that I said best-selling, so we're talking about ideas that are getting out to the general public. Now, naturalism first arose in the late 19th century. In fact, there was a movement actually called literary naturalism. Novels and plays began appearing that portrayed humans as merely products of nature, determined by environment and genetics. For example, virtually every student I've had, whether on the college level or my homeschool, high school classes, have read books by Jack London, especially Call of the Wild. But what many of them don't know is that as a young man, London underwent what one historian calls a conversion experience to radical materialism. He memorized long passages from Charles Darwin and could quote them by heart. He wrote about dogs to soften the blow, but his real message was that humans are nothing but evolved organisms with no free will, governed by natural selection and survival of the fittest. In one of his stories, an old Eskimo is left behind by his family to die in the snow. As the wolves close in to devour him, the old man ponders that, after all, evolution assigns the organism only one task: to reproduce so that the species will survive. After that, if the individual dies, what does it matter after all? Was it not the law of life? The story pounds home the theme that humans have no higher purpose beyond sheer biological existence. Literary naturalism is often summarized in a line from the novelist Theodore Dreiser, who said the individual is the pawn of forces over which he has no control. By the way, Dreiser underwent the same conversion experience to materialist worldview. He later said that reading the evolutionary writers blew him intellectually to bits, destroying the final traces of his religious upbringing. He decided that humans were merely minor elements in a vast mechanistic process of the struggle for existence. Even the style of literary naturalism was modeled on science. As one theater critic writes, the rise of the scientific worldview led to the idea that the stage, or the novel, should become like an instrument of scientific inquiry into human behavior. As a result, literary naturalists aimed at a tone that was detached, clinical, and above all, value-free. No moral analysis. Books appeared that portrayed acts of murder and adultery with clinical detachment. No sympathy, no moral, no redemption. Do you guys read these books in classical conversations? Do you read these novels in classical conversations? Emile Zola wrote, about this book, Schweisser. He said, I was portraying characters without free will. They are human animals, nothing more, governed by the inexorable laws of their physical nature. And yet the goal of portraying people as human animals, nothing more, proved to be a difficult task. It was not easy to flesh out believable characters who made no decisions, but were merely swept along by social and cosmic forces, puppets of fate. It also made for characters who were incredibly dull. There cannot be any real character development if they're helpless victims of outside forces. A professor of film studies says, naturalism was frankly boring. It created dramas which meander and never quite reach a resolution. For example, in Chekhov's Three Sisters, the characters talk about wanting to move to Moscow through all 4 acts of the play and never end up doing it. In my son's homeschool literature class last year, they read Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard. And it was interesting to watch the teenagers struggle with this. Why don't these guys ever do anything? They can't seem to make a decision. A more important objection, though, is that naturalism is not true to life. In reality, humans do make genuine decisions. They're not completely determined. Though naturalism is considered an offshoot of realism, we could say its problem is that it's not realistic enough. It cannot be lived out in the real world. In fact, critics point out that the literary naturalists themselves did not live by their own philosophy. There's a Yale historian who says, they accepted determinism as a theory, but not something to live by. I suggest it's because nobody can live by it, just as no one can live by an empiricist worldview in practice. You might call this the pragmatic test of a worldview. After all, the purpose of a worldview is to explain the world. So just as you test a scientific theory by going into the laboratory and seeing what happens when you actually mix chemicals in test tubes, you test a worldview by seeing how well it works in the real world. Let me give you a contemporary example. Richard Dawkins is perhaps the best known of the new atheists. And he argues that from a naturalistic perspective, we should not hold individuals responsible for what they do, since they're determined anyway. And he likes to illustrate this with a famous episode from British TV show Fawlty Towers. When Fawlty's car won't start, first he scolds it, then he counts to 3, then he picks up a tree branch and starts thrashing it. The episode always gets a laugh, so Dawkins quickly then comes in and says, why don't we laugh at a judge who punishes a criminal, just like we laugh at him for punishing the car when it won't start? Doesn't a truly scientific, mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense of the very idea of responsibility, he says? Interesting, when Dawkins was promoting his latest book, a little later, there was a young man in the audience who challenged him. This young man had read my book, Total Truth, where I discussed this problem, so he was going to test it with real live Richard Dawkins. So he said to Dawkins, are you saying we should not blame or praise people for what they do? And interestingly, Dawkins backtracked, and he said, and this is a direct quote, he said, the trouble is I can't bring myself to do that. I actually do respond in an emotional way, and I blame people, and I give people credit for what they do. And the young man said, yes, but my point is, don't you see that as an inconsistency in your views? And Dawkins replied, I sort of do, yes. But it is an inconsistency that we sort of have to live with. Otherwise, life would be intolerable. This was an astonishing admission that in practice we cannot live by the naturalistic worldview that he himself promotes, that its consequences would be intolerable. See, the practical test of a worldview asks, can you apply it in the real world without doing violence to human nature? Naturalism fails the practical test. In fact, I submit to you that in this kind of pragmatic test, the Christian worldview wins hands down. It teaches that humans are created by a personal God, a supreme agent, who thinks, chooses, and acts. And therefore, Christianity has the intellectual resources to explain why humans are personal agents with the capacity to think, choose, and act. The Christian understanding of the human person fits the real world. Let's turn to something completely different. New Age pantheism. People who hold a pantheistic worldview typically do not argue that Christianity is false so much as they say it is harmful, that the biblical teaching of transcendent God has alienated us from nature, that it's caused Western culture to rape and plunder the earth, and if only we saw ourselves as part of nature, if we had a sense of spiritual oneness with nature, then we'd take better care of it and respect all forms of life. These ideas are especially popular with creative people, like Hollywood screenwriters. I have just one word for you, Avatar. Even the New York Times called Avatar a long apologia for pantheism, a faith that equates God with nature. It calls humanity into religious communion with the natural world. The same themes were already emerging in the Romantic movement in the 19th century. The Romantics were reacting against the Enlightenment with its metaphor of nature as a vast machine and humans just part of the machine and having no free will and so on. So many of them responded by embracing a pantheistic philosophy. God was not the transcendent creator of nature, but a spiritual presence within nature. And the key person here is Hegel, who taught a kind of the concept of an absolute spirit or mind unfolding through history, a kind of spiritual evolution with God as an immanent deity. This was expressed artistically by a glow that almost seems to emanate out of nature itself. Do you see that? Light is traditionally an image symbol for the divine. Individual details are often effaced as everything blends into a harmonious unity, as though dissolving into the universal one, the all. That's a quote from Jean Edward Veith, who is at Patrick Henry College. The first abstract artist was Kandinsky. His pantheistic worldview was extremely influential among artists. He came to believe that the way to overcome philosophical materialism was to get rid of material objects. In his word, abstract art would liberate the mind from the harsh tyranny of the materialistic philosophy and would become one of the most powerful agents of spiritual renewal. In other words, the abstract painting is intended to free the mind from its preoccupation with the material world and draw the viewer up to the spiritual realm. You can see why a lot of people say that Romanticism elevated art to a kind of substitute religion. Well, what kind of religion? The movement that Kandinsky founded is sometimes called abstract expressionism, and art critics often say that this is a form of negative theology. What is negative theology? It's the idea that you can describe the divine only through negations, okay? That the one, the all, is so far beyond human concepts that any description that you might try to make would be false and misleading. So the only way to approach the divine is by negating any conception you might have. Now, negative theology has been a minor element in Christianity, but it's very common in the East. In Hindu and Buddhist meditation, the most popular mantra is the monosyllable Om, right? And what's the purpose of repeating a single monosyllable over and over? It's to clear the mind, to free it from its preoccupation with the physical world, until at last you transcend rational thought, achieve inner silence, and merge with the infinite or the void. This explains why abstract artists created paintings where the canvas is all a single color. The monochromatic painting is kind of the visual parallel to the monosyllabic Om. See that? And just as negative theology tries to approach God through the negation of concepts, artists were saying the same thing through the negation of images. So here you see Ad Reinhardt, best known for a series of black paintings that represent, in his words, a mystical ascent in which the mind leaves behind the world of appearances composed of separate images until it reaches an undifferentiated unity, beyond thought, beyond reason. The theologian Francis Schaeffer had an interesting phrase. He called this a mysticism with nobody there. So, a mystical experience like this might give you a sense of being lifted out of the ordinary world, but to connect with what? not with a transcendent person who loves us and communicates with us and interacts with us, but with sheer silence and emptiness. The abstract expressionist Mark Rothko painted several large dark panels for a chapel called the Rothko Chapel. Those of you from Houston, have you ever gone to the Rothko? Somebody here was from Houston. It's in Houston. Have you gone there? It's in Houston. You should go check it out. What did these dark, somber paintings mean? The person who commissioned the paintings said they expressed the silence of God, the unbearable silence of God. Shortly after finishing the paintings, before the chapel even opened, Rothko committed suicide. A mysticism with nobody there is not enough to give a sense of significance and meaning to life. Today we're told by the New Age movement that pantheism inspires greater respect for life. But in traditional pantheism, like Hinduism, your sense of being a unique individual is an illusion. The technical term is Maya, M-A-Y-A, which means illusion. It's the source of evil. It's the cause of greed and selfishness and war and oppression. So that the goal of meditation is actually to dissolve your sense of being an individual self until you merge with the cosmic one. The idea was captured by a Chinese poet who writes about a short poem about sitting on a mountain as evening falls. And the poem ends with these words: "We sit together, the mountain and I, until only the mountain remains." The poem is frequently quoted in books on meditation. Ah, such peace, such oneness with nature. But what's the poet really saying? He's saying that the person's goal should be to dissolve into the rock of the mountainside. It's radically dehumanizing. The poem implies that the human being has less value and dignity than a rock. So little that it's best to dissolve away and disappear into the rock until only the mountain remains. Now, the reason that Eastern pantheism leads to such a low view of the person is that it has a non-personal starting point. Its deity is not a personal God who thinks, feels, and acts, but a non-cognitive spiritual essence or substance. And that's why, surprising as it may sound, pantheism is really not that different from materialism. It's just the flip side of the same coin. Materialism says everything consists of material stuff. Pantheism says, no, everything consists of spiritual stuff. But both are non-personal. And as a result, both worldviews fail to account for human personhood. Just as water cannot rise above its source, so a non-personal force that does not think, feel, or act is incapable of producing personal agents who do think, feel, and act. And that's why neither materialism nor pantheism has the intellectual resources to account for human beings. Inevitably, these worldviews end up denying those features in humans that they cannot account for, those features that make humans essentially different from a rock. Let's end with postmodernism. People often ask me, how do we argue for Christian truth when we're talking to postmodernists who deny that there is any kind of truth? For the postmodernists, the main objection to Christianity is that it makes universal, trans-historical truth claims. That means truths that stand beyond the flux of history, eternal truths. But if we look at where postmodernism comes from, it too is based on a trans-historical truth claim. The roots are once again in the philosophy of Hegel. People think postmodernism is radically new. I tell my students, if you understand Hegel, you'll understand postmodernism. Recall that Hegel taught a kind of pantheism in which the absolute spirit or mind unfolds dialectically through history. One of the implications of that was that a culture is not the product of individuals so much as it's the product of that collective mind in its current stage of the evolution of consciousness. We talked about that earlier with a question about the evolution of religion. So, in a sense, individuals do not even have original or unique ideas of their own. They're simply absorbing and reflecting back the customs, languages, beliefs of their community. All ideas are historically relative. Well, Hegel's pantheism has fallen away, but what it left behind, sometimes given the label historicism, that means that the idea that we're all unconsciously mouthpieces for the social forces within our historical period, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. multiculturalism, political correctness, all of those words. This is radically dehumanizing because it implies that individuals are powerless to rise above their social group, their group identity. In fact, in art, postmodernism is often summarized in the phrase, death of the artist, death of individual creativity. So in pop art, for example, artists didn't bother to create anything original. They simply held up and mimicked the products of a consumer society. They were just mouthpieces for their culture. In literature, too, an author was said to be unwittingly voicing pre-existing scripts, the scripts of his race, his class, his gender, and so on. Now, of course, at times those scripts are going to contradict one another. So the task of the literary critic is to disentangle the contradictions. This is called deconstructing the text. Does that sound familiar? That's deconstructionism. The assumption is that there is no unified storyline, that a piece of literature is merely a collection of conflicting quotations that the author has picked up unconsciously from the surrounding culture. To convey that idea visually, deconstructionist artists made use of the pastiche or collage, disconnected images that defy any attempt at interpretation, any unified narrative. Artists juxtaposed images in ways to suggest random incoherence to which the artist and viewer can bring no meaningful order. And what was the purpose of that? To suggest that life's random occurrences cannot be made to fit into any inherent hierarchy of meaning. Postmodern architecture has its own version of the collage. Buildings that suggest disequilibrium and instability. Often classic elements are exaggerated out of proportion to create ironic incongruities, like the oversized ionic column in the building on your right. You see that? What is this style saying? The style is saying that there's no unified storyline to the universe, no meta-narrative to explain all of history. Now, the irony of this is, as we've seen, it itself rests on a meta-narrative, on Hegel's philosophy, on his historicism. And so the position is inherently self-contradictory. See, if everything is historically relative, a product of a particular period in history, then so is Hegel's philosophy. So is historicism itself. And then, of course, why should we pay any attention to it? To avoid that inner contradiction, Hegel had to presume that he alone had the power to stand above history and to see it objectively as it really is and tell the rest of us. So in other words, he exempted his own views from the relativistic, historicist categories that he applied to everyone else's views. He acted as though he alone had access to eternal transhistorical truth, the very thing that postmodernists say they object to in Christianity. So remember what Lewis said? Their skepticism is for use on other people's beliefs. They really ought to be more skeptical of their own beliefs. So let me end with a quotation. At a conference of the International Arts Movement in New York City, I had the honor of sharing a podium with a poet, Dana Gioia. Does anyone know who Dana Gioia is? You really should, because he at the time was a chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. See, Christians get all upset when the National Endowment for the Arts funds, outrageous, blasphemous, and indecent art, but we don't pay any attention when a Christian is in office and does good things with it. Dana Gioia, check him out sometime. Anyway, at the conference he says, all art is a language. It's a language of color, sound, movement, or words. When we immerse ourselves in a work of art, we enter into the artist's worldview. Teaching our children how to recognize those worldviews is not optional. It is necessary survival equipment. Every Christian needs the tools to recognize and resist secular worldviews, especially when they come to us not explicitly in words, but in images, story, plotline, so on. In fact, in my view, one of the best ways to do that is with a classical education, because it teaches your mind to think clearly, to recognize logical fallacies, and to feed your mind on the best that has been said and written throughout history. Thank you very much.